My name is Travis Hensley, and I am the president of the Library of Congress Professional Association, who is hosting today's event. The LCPA is the largest and oldest employee organization at the library. I am especially pleased to present this talk in conjunction with the Library of Congress Alumni Network. The Alumni Network provides former colleagues with opportunities to continue their relationship with the library and each other. It is open to former employees, interns, and scholars, regardless of the amount of time they worked at the library, and there are currently more than 1,000 members. Today's talk, titled Arthur A. Houghton, Jr. and the Usual Relationship Between the Library of Congress and Harvard University's Houghton Library, is being given by LC alumni Gary Fitzpatrick. After graduating with a degree from geography from UCLA in 1970, Gary started to work in the Geography and Map Division, where he says the highlight of his career was meeting his future wife, Janice, on his third day at work. The bulk of his career was spent as a reference librarian, but the last 12 years he served as the senior specialist in digital programs, where his job was to find out what the digital cartographic revolution was and how to start integrating it into the library's collections and services. He's the author of 3 books on the history of Hawaiian cartography, as well as 2 books for the general reference market, direct line distances, and international timetables. On several occasions from 1992 through 2008, he taught classes on map and librarianship as part of the adjunct faculty in the Library and Information Sciences program at the University of Hawaii. After retiring from the library in 2004, he briefly served as senior fellow for the geographic policy at the American Association for Geographers. Shortly after, he and his wife had to move to New York to help his parents. That move brought him a new scholarly challenge, writing a biographical saga of the Houghton family of Corning, of which today's presentation is a small part. In an odd twist of fate, Gary was given space to work on that project in the Corning office of the Honorable and Distinguished 9-term Congressman Amo Houghton. Shortly after beginning to work there and discussing their careers, the two realized that Amo was the first and most frequent requester from Congress for original maps that Gary created, a service that he developed as part of his job as a specialist. If that name rings a bell, that is because the library just recently announced the Lewis Houghton Civics and Democracy Initiative, honoring Amo and his colleague in the House of Representatives, John Lewis. Gary would like to point out that this is the second significant thing he has done with the LCPA. Sometime in the late 80s, his story, Romeo and Juliet, Gaithersburg and Burke, was serialized in the LCPA Journal. On behalf of the LCPA and the Library of Congress Alumni Network, please join me in welcoming today's speaker, Gary Fitzpatrick.
Thank you. It's good to see so many people here. I'd like to welcome members of the extended Houghton family who are viewing this online, as well as staff at the Rakow Library of the Corning Museum of Glass, at the Houghton Library at Harvard, and the Arthur A. Houghton Jr. Library at the SUNY Corning Community College campus. This is a highly condensed description of a well-documented topic. Sources that I have tapped into include Arthur's own papers, much of which have recently been transferred from the Corning Incorporated Archives to the Corning Museum of Glass to their Rakow Library, and they're being processed for future use. An important material was also found here at the Library of Congress, the Houghton Library, the Harvard Archives, Princeton University, and the Rosenbach Museum and Library. And I thank the staff of all of those for their assistance. I suspect that few people here today know anything about Arthur A. Houghton, Jr., even something as basic as the fact that the Harvard's Houghton Library is named after him. And today I'll share some Library of Congress history that connects this institution with that library. The title, Chief Rare Book and Special Collections Division, does not appear in Library of Congress history until 1945. Those two terms were preceded by a single phrase from 1930 through 1934. It was custodian of rare books. and from 1935 through 1945, curator of rare books. The last person to hold the title, curator of rare books, can be found in the first sentence of a press release issued by Librarian of Congress Archibald MacLeish on March 31st, 1940. It reads, Arthur A. Houghton, Jr. has been appointed curator of the rare book collection in the Library of Congress to take office on April 1st, 1940. That's right. The man for whom Harvard's Rare Book Library is named was in charge of rare books here at the Library of Congress. If Arthur worked here, why did Harvard name their library after him? Well, let's first look at how Arthur came to be a part of this institution. The major reorganization for which MacLeish is known proceeded slowly for two reasons. He was not a librarian, and thus it took him time to understand the library, and his confirmation process was brutal. He was labeled by senators a fellow traveler and a Red, a communist sympathizer, and therefore he could not risk making mistakes early in his tenure. Thus, he only made 2 staff appointments in his first year, one of which was curator of rare books, which had been in limbo for quite some time. He offered the position to A.S.W. Rosenbach, the famed Philadelphia and New York bookseller, the man who had helped build the Huntington, Widener, Folger, and Morgan collections. Partly because of his age, Rosenbach turned down the position. His rejection may also have been due to the fact that he was opposed to MacLeish's appointment, and he may not have wanted to be part of that team. A few days after interviewing with MacLeish, however, he called back with a suggestion and followed that up with a letter. He wrote, "In accordance with my conversation over the telephone, I would like to suggest to you, as curator of the Rare Book Division of the Library of Congress, Arthur A. Houghton, Jr. of Corning, New York, and Y Plantation, Maryland. I would consider this an ideal appointment. And why, I can hear you ask? Arthur Houghton is, in my opinion, the greatest collector of books in this country. He has a wonderful flair, and his knowledge and memory are remarkable. He knows the insides as well as outsides of books. He is an accomplished bibliographer and has been of assistance to many writers and scholars. He's known to all collectors and students throughout the world." Arthur was a member of the Houghton family of Corning, New York. That didn't change, did it? Oh, there we go. I'm sorry. Theirs was not a glamorous business at all. In 1940, the principal products were such things as glass enclosures for light bulbs and vacuum tubes, thermometer glass, sealed headlamps, and Pyrex, a unique form of glass that came out of the company's laboratory. Arthur was vice president of the company as well as president of its Steuben glass division in New York City. Arthur's father died during his junior year at Harvard, which caused him to lose track of where he was in his studies, and he ended up being one course short of graduation requirements at the end of his 4th year. So he never actually graduated from Harvard, as everyone believed, and many people still believe. That setback was offset by becoming a very wealthy man while still in college. Now, it isn't always true, but generally, I think, a nice collection of rare books begins with a nice collection of money. And that explains why Arthur was able to begin engaging in his avocation by starting with Lewis Carroll first editions while still at Harvard. By early 1939, when MacLeish first approached Arthur, his collection had grown considerably, as would be detailed in the press release that MacLeish would later release. I'm pointing at the wrong place, I'm sorry. Mr. Houghton began to collect rare books and manuscripts shortly after his graduation from Harvard. In addition to his distinguished collections of Keats, Spenser, and Lewis Carroll, he has made important collections of original letters and manuscripts of Samuel Pepys, original autograph letters of Robert and Elizabeth Browning, and original manuscripts and letters of Boswell and Johnson, including the manuscript of Boswell's Life of Johnson. His library also contains a Gutenberg Bible, a first folio of Shakespeare, 1623, perfect and in the original binding, Shakespeare's poems, 1640, in the original binding, the finest copy known, Milton's Paradise Lost, 1667, in the original binding, the finest copy known, Ben Jonson's work, 1616, a large paper presentation copy, Chapman's Homer, a presentation copy, and the original autograph letters of Lord Chesterfield to his godson. The Rosenbach Library and Museum in Philadelphia has complete records of Arthur's purchases through that firm. From roughly 1932 to 1939, he spent almost $900,000 just with Rosenbach. I know from his papers that he was dealing with Robinson and Maggs Brothers in London at the same time, as well as numerous other American dealers. Traditional comparative tables imply that his $900,000 investment reflects $20 million today, given inflation and so forth. But he only paid $50,000 for his Gutenberg. Now, oh, by the way, he would own two of them in his lifetime. But if you use the roughly $30 million that it would cost to buy a Gutenberg today as a guide, then it would take roughly $540 million today to buy books and manuscripts comparable to what he purchased just from Rosenbach. By the way, Rosenbach called his Gutenberg Bible and his first folio Arthur's trinkets. I think it's clear why McLeish decided to follow up on Rosenberg's recommendation. He reached out to Arthur in early December 1939, but did not get an immediate decision. It would take 4 months of pursuit before Arthur accepted the offer. Before I go any further, let me point out that the distinguished-looking Arthur Houghton in the original slide was not the Arthur that McLeish was recruiting. Here is what Arthur looked like in 1939 when he was being recruited. He had just turned 33 when McLeish first approached him. McLeish was not the only one interested in Arthur, however. A few months earlier, William Jackson, the recently appointed rare book librarian at Harvard, invited Arthur to join the visiting committee of Harvard's libraries. Arthur did not attend any meetings of the committee until late January of 1940, about 6 weeks after beginning his discussions with McLeish. That meeting is legendary in Houghton Library history because the chairman of the visiting committee, Charles Warren, strongly objected to Harvard even collecting rare books, let alone building a separate library for them. That did not sit well with Arthur, with Jackson, or Philip Hofer, a friend and former Harvard student. There are two stories about what happened next. One is told by William Bond, who succeeded Jackson as director of the Houghton Library, and he described this in a Houghton Library Chronicle, 1942 to 1992. The other was told by Philip Hofer in the September 18, 1969 edition of Harvard Crimson. They both agree that after the disastrous meeting, Jackson and Hofer went back to the Ritz-Carlton, where they and Arthur drank considerable whiskey and debated what to do. It was decided that Hofer and Arthur would embark on a Midwestern and East Coast expedition to raise money for a rare book library. Bond claims that the next morning, Arthur announced there was no need for such an expedition because he had decided he would fund it himself. Bond was not at that meeting, however, so he was merely reporting what he heard from others. Oops, I'm sorry, I'm behind. Hofer, however, offered a more entertaining version of what transpired. In late spring, Arthur arrived to take off on the agreed-upon expedition. But when he saw his luggage would not fit in Hofer's roadster, he suggested they go back inside the Widener Library. There, Arthur explained that an aunt had died and left him money he didn't need. That's nice. And he would use that to fund the library himself. Hofer claimed it was $1 million. Neither story is correct, but neither is terribly wrong. There was drinking and discussion at the hotel, but Arthur's decision to fund the library came about over the course of a couple of months. There is more documentation than I can present here, so let me say that it was a gradual decision that went from merely offering to help to thinking about creating a, quote, treasure room, to finally recognizing that a new separate structure was needed. Hofer was not wrong about the luggage and the roadster. Arthur did show up in late spring, but for a meeting with someone else. And to keep from embarrassing Hofer, he told him a white lie about the inheritance. An aunt did die, oddly on the same day McLeish's press release was issued, but I have seen the will, and she left him only $56,000, which was not enough even then to build the library. What Arthur did do was give Harvard 6,000 shares of Corning Glass stock, but since it was not publicly traded at the time, it's impossible to set an actual value on the gift. The period in which Arthur was wrestling with how to help out Harvard was the same in which he was vacillating over the Library of Congress offer. By the last week of March 1940, the general principles of the Harvard gift were understood, and it was then that he visited McLeish to work out the details of taking the position of curator of rare books here. In the following months, while getting his feet wet in his new job here, he finalized the funding issue with Harvard, helped in the design of the library. It's basically a 3 times enlargement of his personal library in Y Plantation, and he added a codicil to his will, promising his entire collection to Harvard upon his death. That codicil, however, was negated later on. They never did get his collection. And he began processing his Keats and Spencer material to transfer to Harvard once the new library was finished. And that is how the Houghton Library was created, by a Library of Congress employee. But what happened at the Library of Congress? Strange things, to say the least. McLeish agreed to an arrangement unheard of, at least to me, in the Library of Congress history. Arthur would only work 20 hours a week here. And if my impression is correct upon reading his papers, that turned out to be an aspirational goal and not a requirement. In addition, it was accepted that Arthur would continue running Steuben Glass in New York City and would remain on several corporate boards. That it was mentioned in the press release that he would continue those corporate activities leads me to believe that McLeish saw in Arthur a potential ally in changing the culture of the institution. In that press release, McLeish wrote, "He brings to the Library of Congress a unique combination of administrative experience in the founding of a business engaged in the manufacture of objects of art and in the direction and experience of that business, practical experience on the boards of large corporations, a wide knowledge of book collectors and book collecting, a familiarity with book trade and book markets, and a broad cultivation in the fields of American and English literature." An interesting aspect of Arthur's appointment is that unlike any other mid-level management position during the 60 years I've known about the Library of Congress, his appointment received national attention. The Washington Post and the New York Times ran significant articles. Most embarrassing, the Associated Press ran a story that may have appeared in several hundred newspapers across the country, in which a somewhat pejorative term was applied to Arthur, the, quote, millionaire assistant. In particular, the New York Times brought attention to his part-time attendance and continued work with Steuben-Glass and on boards. While the article generally is complimentary to Arthur, bringing out those unusual aspects of his continued outside employment was not totally benign. After all, the Great Depression was still winding down, and surely there were professional librarians who would have given an arm and a leg for the position and would have devoted their entire work week to the job. And how might ordinary citizens think about some millionaire getting a job that somebody else could have had? In that sense, it is remarkable and I think intentional that the three people at Harvard who knew what was going on with Arthur kept absolutely silent about Arthur's contributions toward building its new library. Not a word leaked during the whole time it was being built that Arthur was the donor. Imagine if that had also been brought out in the New York Times article. In hindsight, it seems that McLeish went far out on a limb hiring Arthur under the conditions that he did. And after several years of working on this project, I honestly can't say whether McLeish knew how close he was to having that limb cut off behind him. You see, the reporters missed something that was public knowledge that could have blown up McLeish's career over this. It turns out that Arthur was a man dealing with serious legal issues. Maybe even on the same day that he received his first inquiry from McLeish, Arthur received notice from the Justice Department that he was one of close to 100 co-defendants in the largest antitrust case brought to date. In fact, the Justice Department was trying to release about 90 of those co-defendants, glassmakers all, from onerous contracts forced on them by Arthur, a couple of other executives of Corning Glass, and a handful of men associated with General Electric. To be frank, they were guilty, guilty, guilty. And when the verdict finally arrived in late 1942, it threatened the existence of Corning Glass. But for some reason, the reporters who wrote those articles about Arthur never made that connection, and it never got linked together in the press. I cannot imagine what Roosevelt's opponents in Congress would have done if they had gotten that together. Oops. To the best of my knowledge, there is nothing illegal about the arrangements under which Arthur came to work at the library. Many LC employees, especially ones at the start of their career, work second jobs. As long as you keep a clear separation between the two, serving on a corporate board can be legal. But there are two important issues. Should there be an actual or perceived conflict of interest, then you have a problem. Other than working on the Houghton Library, I came across nothing that I construed as Arthur favoring Harvard over the Library of Congress. In fact, he did undercut his alma mater at one point when he warned McLeish that Harvard was negotiating with the British at the start of the war to bring a lot of the important historic British documents to Harvard for safekeeping. And Arthur felt that the library should be doing that and not Harvard, so he warned McLeish about that. The other issue is appearances, and appearances can always be interpreted to fit one's needs. And again, I think that McLeish risked harming the library given that he was political poison and so closely tied to President Roosevelt. McLeish was not someone that an underling had chosen and Roosevelt merely signed off on. The two were very, very closely connected. And so if Arthur's favorable work arrangements, the Harvard donation, and the antitrust thing had all come public, I think that would have been a firestorm, especially considering Republicans were desperately trying to keep Roosevelt from getting a third term. So this would have all broke while Roosevelt was doing that. So what is Arthur's legacy at the Library of Congress? Very little, primarily because within days after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, Arthur accepted a commission as captain in the U.S. Army and officially left the library in January 1942. The Houghton Library opened the same month, at which time it was finally revealed that Arthur was the donor and was acknowledged at the same time to be the curator of rare books at the Library of Congress. Basically, he was not here long enough to leave much of a mark, but if you look in the annual report, the librarian's annual report for 1940 and read the part about rare books, which Arthur wrote, you'll see that he had a firm grasp, I think, of where he wanted to go had he stayed. That was not the end of Arthur's formal relationship with the library, however. He served as either consultant or fellow in English bibliography from the late 1940s through the late 60s. At one time, there was an Arthur Houghton Fund for purchasing rare materials. He frequently is mentioned in the librarian's reports to Congress for donating rare books. Roughly 4 decades before the Madison Council was established, he was recommending the creation of such a body, and his relationship with the library ended with his service on the Library of Congress Trust Fund Board from 1967 to 1972. What if? It's always fun to speculate on what might have been, but to speculate about Arthur and the Library of Congress needs to be done on a different level rather than the rare book division. In the course of my research into Arthur, I came across an astounding story. As a Library of Congress employee, I was flabbergasted. It's a story that's never been told. Only because I had access to Arthur's papers was I able to recognize it and match it up with documents in other places to verify it. When all those men and women joined the military after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, they did not immediately march off. The military wasn't ready for them. Arthur, for instance, did not actually get called up to serve until May of 1942, 5 months after he actually joined the military. In the interim, McLeish invited Arthur to be part of a new initiative called the Experimental Division on Library Cooperation. Its members included the who's who of American libraries. Arthur worked on the issue of manuscripts, which was headed by Julian Boyd, the librarian of Princeton University. Boyd and Arthur were close in age and became great friends, and Arthur spent considerable time in the Princeton area while waiting to be called up. He tossed in $500 or $1,000 here and there to help Boyd with projects that Boyd was developing. He gave a talk that inspired Princeton's president to immediately set up a committee to raise money for a new rare book library. And the two kept in contact even after Arthur became an active military member. As the war was winding down, however, Arthur was transferred to New York City to work on the onerous task of verifying the completion of military contracts and initiating payment. To give you an idea of what Arthur was like, he, on his military salary, I doubt, he rented a penthouse, 10-room penthouse with balcony at 740 Park Avenue, arguably the most prestigious address in the city. And it was around then that in mid-November 1944, shortly after the election of Roosevelt to his 4th term, Arthur received a letter from Boyd in which Boyd wrote about an impending meeting at the White House where President Roosevelt would offer him, Boyd, the job of Librarian of Congress. During the summer of '44, Roosevelt decided to move McLeish to the State Department to help promote the establishment of the United Nations. McLeish then sent a letter listing 3 people suited to being his replacement. Number 1 on the list was Boyd, and another was Quincy Adams, the director of the Folger Library. But given McLeish was still political poison among some in Congress, it was agreed that the change in position would not take place until after the election. So after the election, they began the process of replacing him, and so Boyd was given word somehow that this was going to happen. And so Boyd had written Arthur to ask for thoughts on the direction in which the library should go. I'm sorry that the reply is too long to read here, for Arthur basically nailed it. Much of what happened in the library under Evans and Mumford was anticipated by Arthur in that letter to Boyd. Now, the strange thing is that Boyd didn't want the job. He had just started the project that defines his legacy, editing the papers of Thomas Jefferson. Boyd was certain the librarian's job would not be offered to a professional librarian, however. And thus he said to Arthur, quote, "The finger points at you." Arthur demurred with an unconvincing statement of not being qualified, and besides, he was in the Army and thus not eligible, to which Boyd responded, the President, as Commander-in-Chief, could assign him anywhere he wanted. Boyd did meet with the President on January 11th, 1945, and was offered the position. The next day, Boyd penned a note thanking Roosevelt for the offer, but declining. So, did he suggest Arthur during that January 11th meeting? Well, within 3 days, Rosenbach received confirmation that the President had his letter backing the appointment of Arthur to the position of Librarian of Congress. And Quincy Adams, one of McLeish's candidates for the job, also wrote in support of Arthur's appointment. But we all know what happened. Before acting on those recommendations, Roosevelt left the country for nearly a full month to meet with Churchill and Stalin in Yalta, and had only a few busy weeks between his return and death. He never got around to filling the position. Truman sought advice from the American Library Association and appointed Luther Evans to the job. There's an odd little twist on the story. Although neither landed the position of Librarian of Congress when they might have, from 1971 to 73, they eventually came together in service to the library and on the same page in the librarian's annual report. Boyd as the consultant in American history, and Arthur in his long-running role as consultant in English bibliography. It's interesting to speculate on what Arthur might have accomplished as Librarian of Congress. What he did in his later career certainly suggests he could have handled the position with ease. But the most interesting speculation is what would have happened to New York City had Arthur gotten the job here. It might not be the place it is today. You see, it's easy to make an argument that Arthur was the most influential person in the cultural life of New York City from the end of the war through the early 1970s. In the early 50s, he joined the board of the New York Philharmonic. Shortly thereafter, it was told it would have to leave Carnegie Hall in 3 years. The task of finding a new home fell to Arthur. He worked with 4 other men to develop the plan for the Lincoln Center for the Performing Arts. The original group brought in John D. Rockefeller III to put a more prominent person at the head of it, but when the Lincoln Center was incorporated, Arthur was the vice president behind Rockefeller and worked closely with him in raising the money and overseeing the construction of the Lincoln Center. In 1962, Arthur stepped down from the Lincoln Center and Philharmonic positions. He was then chairman of the board of the latter, and accepted the position of president and later chairman of the board of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which he led through a tumultuous 10 years. He had a major impact on many other city institutions, as well as cultural institutions in general. For instance, the New York Public, the Folger, and the Morgan asked him to start Madison Council-like groups. Even the Bodleian Library asked him to start an American-based Friends group. It's a mistake, however, to look at Arthur only from the perspective of arts and humanities. He was an industrialist first and foremost. In that capacity, he had an enormous impact on libraries. Actually, he had a great impact on how we all live our lives each day. Now, I've got a little aside here. Prior to being a congressman, Amo Houghton, who was mentioned earlier, Congressman Amo Houghton, was the CEO of Corning Glass for 20 years. Arthur was a major shareholder and a director in the company at the same time. Amo had a problem. The company had developed some new products with great potential, but there was no market for them at the time. As Amo explained to me, Arthur understood the potential of those products and supported pouring money into the development of them, even though there was no short-term prospect of revenue. What were those products? Well, the first is something we know is Gorilla Glass on your phone, which allowed cell phones to become touch-sensitive smartphones. The second was an incredibly strong form of very thin flat glass. It's what we are looking at when we aren't looking at our phones. You know, the laptop screens, the flat screen monitors, and the gigantic televisions that we all have in our homes. And what was the third? Well, that's what makes possible all the online work and entertainment that we engage in constantly. Today, there are more than 2 billion miles of glass called fiber optic cable linking the world. All three of those glass products were developed by Corning Glass when Amo Houghton was its CEO and Arthur a major stockholder and director. It's not commonly recognized, but those products were being developed either before or about the same time that Robert Noyce and his colleagues developed the first microprocessor. When the first microprocessors were mostly powering calculators, the scientists at Corning were already working on sending vast quantities of data thousands of miles near the speed of light. By the time Intel's chips reached the Pentium level, the fiber optic cable and the quality flat glass were waiting. The Gorilla Glass had to wait for Steve Jobs and the iPhone. No, Arthur did not invent any of those forms of glass, but like other Houghton men who ran the family company over 5 generations, he understood that research was the key to the company's long-term success. Corning Glass was one of the first American companies to create a standalone research operation. Now, here is something ironic about Arthur taking on so many leadership positions. His daughter, Holly, told me that he rarely went to the Philharmonic's concerts. He let her and her mother do that. The radio at home was never turned on for music. It was only turned on for the BBC music, BBC News, and then turned off immediately afterwards. As she explained, quote, "If there was a special gala at the Met, he might go, but while everyone else stayed for encores 3 through 11, we were in the car on the way home." He knew those other arts were important and should be supported, she said. They just were not for him. He read poetry, English literature. He was an Anglophile at heart. It may well be that he accepted the challenge as he did because he felt obligated to live up to the example of the remarkable family he was part of. Or there is just something in the Houghton genetic code or upbringing that inclines them to make themselves useful. For instance, 2 of his father's first cousins were, in many respects, second only to Alice Paul and Lucy Burns in the suffrage movement. One of them, Catherine, co-founded the predecessor of Planned Parenthood with Margaret Sanger. Now, here's an interesting tidbit. Sanger was born in Corning, and she first recognized the importance of family planning by comparing her mother's life to those of the wealthy Houghton women. Her older sister, Mary, was a domestic worker in the home of Nellie Houghton Abbott, Arthur's great aunt. And so it was through the Houghtons that Sanger saw how their small families benefited women compared to the 18 pregnancies, including 5 miscarriages that her mother endured. After editing The Suffragist, the final 3 years before the 19th Amendment passed, the other sister, Edith, talked Alice Paul out of retiring from public life and worked with her throughout the 1920s to craft and promote the Equal Rights Amendment. If you read these 2 books, you will get a different perspective on why women needed the vote than what you will get in most histories. Arthur's uncle, Alonson Houghton, was the most important diplomat in the 1920s, serving as our first ambassador to Germany after World War I, and then taking up the ambassadorial post in Great Britain when our post-war relations with that country were at its lowest. According to Alonson's biographer, had Hoover not won on the first round of voting in the 1928 Republican Convention, Alonson's name would have been put forth as a unifying candidate for the Republican presidential nomination. Arthur's first cousin, Alice Tolley, needs no introduction to anyone who is interested in classical music. Even before donating the funds for the Lincoln Center Hall that bears her name, she was a patron of music in the same league as Whitall and Coolidge. Arthur's first cousin, Amo Houghton, led the War Production Board in D.C. for the early part of World War II, which meant he had absolute authority to tell any company to stop producing some non-essential goods and could order them to produce whatever war material was suitable for their factories. And as deputy chief of the economic mission to London in the latter part of the war, he was in charge of allocating non-military resources for the entire Allied sphere of influence. And almost finally, Arthur mentored Amo Houghton, who was 20 years younger than him. And as mentioned earlier, Amo served in the House of Representatives for 9 terms. Amo was the last of the New England progressive Republicans who gladly worked across the aisle with Democrats on social issues. Arthur also mentored Jamie Houghton, the last family member to run the company. To give an idea of how well respected the family was, at the turn of the last century, Jamie simultaneously was CEO of Corning Inc., served on the boards of MetLife, ExxonMobil, and J.P. Morgan, was chairman of the board of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and the senior fellow of Harvard Corporation. Try to match that resume. This is a photo from when I visited Amo at, this is it, at Amo's home in Cohasset. Jamie came to visit, and this picture was taken about the time we had a fun conversation about the most famous Houghton of them all, Katharine Houghton Hepburn. I have found 0 documents exchanged between the two, but the family says that she and Arthur had a close relationship. And something's a little strange, but it's okay. But the obvious testament that they did have a close relationship is that she traveled a long way out of her way for his funeral in 1990. And by the way, all of her biographers are wrong. Her family was not born into wealth. Her grandfather was not part of the team that built the company in the late 19th century. I've read all the wills. I know her mother did not get much at all from the one ancestor who counted. So basically, that's my story. The last thing I want to say is that while getting to study the Houghton family has been a fascinating and rewarding experience. Getting to work side by side in Amo's office the last 4 years of his life has been one of the highlights of my life. There's an institution across the street he dearly loved, which could use his integrity, honesty, humility, and wisdom right now. I am so pleased that the library has honored him with the Civics and Democracy Initiative. And as odd and short as it was, I think the library's association with the remarkable Arthur A. Houghton Jr. is a bit of our history that deserves being better known. So thank you.
From the audience or our audience online, we'll also have a microphone and have those questions read from the Q&A. Anyone in the room have a question for Gary?
So, Gary, thank you so much for that. That was
Thank
incredibly...
you for coming. I was hoping you would be here.
Yeah, I wouldn't miss it. So, with Arthur Houghton having so much going on, you know, at the time that he was negotiating this possibility of being the curator for the Library of Congress and for the Rare Book Division, you know, what do you think drew him to that position? Especially again, and I know you've talked a little bit about, you know, speculation is necessary in some of these stories. So I'm gonna ask you to speculate again of what do you think sort of drew him in that way? You know, when he had so many things pulling him in so many different directions.
It's kind of complicated. One is the Hartford Empire case was very dangerous. They were really under threat there. And that put a lot of stress on his relationship with his cousin Am, who was running the company. But he also was under stress because he had screwed things up at Steuben Glass with some personal issues that he had initiated. And I think that he was sort of looking at it as a way to transition and get away from so much control of the rest of the family. But also, I think that just his love of books is the most important thing. The correspondence that he wrote to his mother during his honeymoon, one of those extended all-summer honeymoons through Europe with his bride, ended with him spending the last week in London doing nothing but buying books. Now, they weren't rare books, and this is the most insightful thing. What he bought were collections like 8-volume or 10-volume or 15-volume sets of the writings of major English writers. He was assembling a reference library. And so he was truly interested in the literature itself. And that's, to me, is the remarkable thing about his personal library that he had built at Y Plantation, is it was just big enough to house his collection at the time. One side had the Gutenberg Bible and the folios and this. The other side was a small sitting room with the Lewis Carroll material. And so he never started on this with the idea of building a library like the Morgans or the Huntingtons. It was strictly a library and a collection for his love of literature, and especially English literature. As far as what he might have done with the Rare Book Division, he did cause some wrinkles with some of the top officials at the library during his short term. He would have done things differently, but I think if he had stayed and if McLeish had stayed, they would have worked really well together. He did some interesting things. I don't know if you've seen it, but they published a small volume about a dedication to a very popular book collector at the time. I'm sorry, senior moment here, I can't remember his name. Oh, Newton. Yeah, a little, about 6 or 8 page thing. I have 2 copies of it. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it was just something Arthur wanted to do to acknowledge who major collectors were and donors and so forth. So I think he had some original ideas. But again, he was very patriotic, so as soon as the war came, he joined right away.
Do you know if he had a relationship with Roosevelt?
This is the big question. I think it was January of '42, and right now I can't remember if the letter is here in the library or if I saw it in Arthur's papers. I think it's here in the library. It was a letter he wrote to Rosenbach saying that the military did not want the library to accept Rosenbach's offer of housing our rarest material at his own estate during the war because it was too close to many military targets. Now, from that letter, I'd have to read it again. It sounds like Arthur went to Rosenbach's place to examine the facility. And that would have occurred within days after the announcement that the Houghton Library was open and that Arthur had been the donor. Had they been together, there is no way they would not have talked about Arthur's decision to fund that library and to initiate, for Arthur to probably have inquired of Rosenbach what his intentions were. So I think it is a reasonable thing to speculate that Arthur may have influenced Rosenbach to some extent. He may not have, but I don't think it's unreasonable. And also, in the registers at the Rosenbach Library, registers are two ways. There's cards where you have all of the purchases from one person, and then there's a chronological list. And there's one page in which Arthur and Lessing bought books one after the other. So they were probably there the same day. So I know that they were reasonably close. So yeah, he may have influenced that, I think. Any?
You said that there was a codicil to the will where his collection after his death was to go to the...
Yeah.
But you said more on that later and you never...
Okay, the interesting thing about Arthur is that he did not give his collection in its entirety to any institution. He actually sold most of it on the market. He decided that he wanted other collectors to have the opportunity to own some of the things he owned. His first folio, he owned all 4 folios. They ended up in Japan. His first Gutenberg ended up in Germany, and I think his second Gutenberg ended up at the University of Texas. My mind's a little foggy on that at the moment. I don't. So he had it sold at Sotheby's in London, not in the U.S., and it netted something like $3 or $4 million, something like that. That would have been in the early 80s. But he did give his Lewis Carroll collection to the Morgan Library. He did not give it to Harvard because they said they already had a good collection of Lewis Carrolls.
Well, Gary, I want to thank you for coming for this great talk. We do think this is America's greatest library, so we'd like to offer this to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, and we invite everyone to stay to ask some more questions, and thank everyone for joining online. Again, thanks so much.